Hello people. Have you ever observed the land, type of soil and water availability in the region you live in? How has it influenced the lifestyle of the people there? 90% of the world population occupies only 30% of the land area. The remaining 70% of the land is either sparsely populated or uninhabited. Let's dive deep into the learnings now. Land. It is a very important natural resource. Land covers 30% of the surface and not every part of it is habitable. The cause for the uneven population in certain parts is varied characteristics of land and climate. Now, see the table that is given here. So, what are the areas that are sparsely populated or uninhabited? That is the rugged topography, the steep slopes of the mountains, low-lying areas susceptible to water, etc. And the densely populated areas are what? They are like your plains, your river valleys, and the lands that are suitable for agriculture. So, did you find the difference? That is, the areas that are sparsely populated are the ones that are actually difficult to live in. There is, very, very bad climate, no agriculture, stuff like that, danger is more. Whereas on the other hand side, the areas that are densely populated are the areas where the agriculture is good, the climate is good, it's not very dangerous to live in, and that is why it's actually densely populated. So let's move further and actually learn what are the uses of land. Now, the land is used for different purposes such as agriculture, forestry, mining, building houses, roads, and setting up of industries. Now, what are the physical factors that determine the use of a land? So, the physical factors which actually are going to determine is going to be the topography, the soil, the climate, minerals, and the availability of the water. And what are going to be the human factors? They are going to be your population and technology. Now, land can also be classified into your private land and the community land on the basis of the ownership. Now, the name suggests private means it's of a particular individual or a group of individual, whereas community means it's for basically your public. Now, the private land is owned by individuals, whereas community land is owned by the community or for the common uses such as your collection of fodder, your fruits, your nuts, or medicinal herbs. What is going to be the another name for community land? Come on. It's going to be the common property resources, right? Even though people's demands are ever growing, the availability of land is limited, and we all know that. Thus, leading people to encroach on land, to build commercial areas and shopping complexes in urban areas, and to actually expand agricultural land in rural areas. This expansion of agriculture and construction activities also leads to the major threats like what you can have your land degradation. So you might have your land, degradation. So you might have your land degradation. Then all or क्या हो सकता है? It can be your landslides, then soil erosion. So it can be soil erosion, desertification. So all these things are the ones that can actually happen. All right. So land degradation can happen, landslides can happen, soil erosion can happen, desertification can happen. So all these things can actually happen. But how to actually conserve the land resources? So the ever-growing population and their growing demands lead to a large-scale destruction of forest covers and other natural resources. Meanwhile, given are the common methods used to conserve the land resources. So what are the common methods that are used to conserve the land resources? They are afforestation, that is growing more and more trees and plants. Okay, that can be afforestation, then land reclamation, then regulated use of chemical pesticides and fertilizers, because if we are going to use chemical pesticides and fertilizers in large quantities, then it's actually going to degrade the quality of the land which we are using them upon. Then check on overgrazing as well, because if overgrazing is done, then the land is going to be what? Basically, if there are going to be no plants, then there is going to be nothing to hold the soil and bind it. Alright, so things like soil erosion can easily happen, and it's going to do nothing but to actually deteriorate the land which all these things are happening on. So let's study further, and let's start with soil. So the thin layer of grainy substance covering the surface of the earth are closely linked to the land. And this is exactly what is known as your soil. Landforms determine the type of soil. This is very true. If you are traveling, you might have noticed that in different areas there are different forms of soil. And soil is made up of organic matter, minerals, and weathered rocks found on the earth. Through the process of weathering, the right mix of minerals and organic matter makes the soil fertile. And this is exactly how we can actually make the soil fertile. But I have a question for you. We know what is soil. We know what is land now. Have you heard of the term landslides? Have you heard of this term, landslides? And if it happens, then what exactly is the reason for it to occur? So, landslides is actually the mass movement of rock, debris, or earth down a slope. And that is nothing but it's a landslide. And it often takes place in conjunction with your earthquakes, your flood, and volcanoes. Meanwhile, a prolonged spell of rainfall can also cause a landslide. So now basically the thing is that the movement of your rocks, your debris, or earth down a slope is basically what is your landslide. So the one reason why landslide could happen is also because of the soil. Suppose it's not binded properly. Okay, there is like overgrazing. Suppose there is like overgrazing. So if there is overgrazing and there are no plants, then what can actually happen is that there is nothing which actually binds the soil, and hence landslides can actually happen. So this is exactly what are your landslides. Next, let's study about mitigation mechanism. So development in scientific techniques has empowered us to understand what factors cause landslides and how to actually manage them. And some of the broad techniques are given here. So this is exactly what is mitigation mechanism. That is, we need to make all the improvements so that the landslides do not happen. And what are these improvements? They are the hazardous mapping to locate the areas which are prone to landslides. Obviously, we cannot control the landslides, but we can actually get a sense that already these are the areas that are prone to landslides, so let's just not get settled in that area. Next is the construction of retention wall to stop the land from sliding. So it can happen is that suppose there is a land which can slide, okay? So if this is a piece of land which can actually slide, so we can actually build some sort of, retention areas, or you can say, construct some form of retention wall, so that if the land is sliding, it's not going, and disrupting the whole amount of people who are living here. The wall can actually just, push it back, or you can say just stop it here itself only, and it's not disrupting all the people who are living in this area. The next is increase in vegetation cover to arrest the landslide. This is exactly what I made you understand in the previous slide, that if we have soil, obviously we have soil, and if there is no plants which are growing on top of that soil, then there is nothing, because actually the roots of the plants bind the soil. And if there are no plants, then there is no binding which is actually happening, and the possibility of landslide actually increases. So this is exactly what they are saying, that if the vegetation increases, if the cover actually increases, then it can aid to arrest the landslide. Next is the surface drainage control works to control the movement of a landslide along with rainwater and spring flows. So what we can actually do is the surface draining system, so that all the water that is getting collected into your rainwater or your spring flow cannot cause your landslide. Let's move further and discuss the degradation of soil and conservation methods next. So soil erosion and depletion are the major threats of the soil as a resource, and we know that it is what? It's soil erosion and your depletion, and both human and natural factors can lead to the degradation of the soils. And what are the factors? It's deforestation, it's overgrazing, it's overuse of chemical fertilizers or pesticides, it's rain washes, it's landslides and floods. So all these methods are what they are basically why degradation of soil actually happens. But what if we need to do some form of conservation of soil? If we need to do conservation of soil, then there are various techniques which we can utilize. Like for example, the first one is your mulching. So what is mulching? It's actually the bare ground between the plant is covered with a layer of organic matter like your straw, and it helps to retain the soil mixture, and that is exactly what is mulching. enriching. That is, suppose we have a plant here and we have a plant here, and then there is going to be ground in between them. So there is this, sort of cover of what a layer of organic matter like your straw, and this is actually going to help to retain the moisture, which will actually do what? It's actually going to avoid the degradation of soil. Next is your contour barriers. So what are contour barriers? That is the stone or grass or soil are used to build barriers along the contours. Trenches are made in front of the barriers to collect water. So basically what exactly they are saying is, I'm going to just erase this thing to make you people explain. Okay, so what they are saying is, like, suppose this is a piece of land, okay, and suppose this piece of land is actually like this. So it's a slope and there is this piece of land. So if I'm going to build contours, okay, around it, so it's going to absorb the water, contours of what your stone and grass, and then the fall of anything, because of the soil degradation can actually reduce. Next is your rock dam. What is your rock dam? Its rocks are piled up to slow down the flow of water and also to prevent gullies and further soil erosion. And so yeah, stones are basically used, stones or rocks, and that is basically known as what your rock dam. Next is your terrace farming. I hope you people have heard of terrace farming, but let's just revise it again. It's broad flat steps or terraces which are made on the steep slopes so that the flat surfaces are available to grow crops and thus reducing the surface runoff and soil erosion. So that is exactly what your terrace farming is. Now let me move further and understand what is intercropping, what is contour plowing, and what is your shelter beds before moving further. So intercropping basically means that different crops are grown in alternate rows and are sown at different times to protect the soil from rainwash. So it's basically nothing that one row will be of one type of plant and the other one will be of another type of your crop. And that is exactly what intercropping basically means. Next is your contour plowing. Your contour plowing is that plowing parallel to the contours of a hill slope so that a natural barrier for water to flow down the slope is made. So for example, you have a hill slope like this. So you are actually, doing your contour plowing actually like this only, so that there is this natural barrier of water flow down the slope is actually created for the water flow that is down the slope. So we basically have to make a natural barrier, and for that we need to make contours on the hill slope, like parallel to it basically. The last one is your shelter beds. So in the coastal and dry regions, rows of trees are planted to check the wind movement to protect the soil cover. So this is exactly what is meant by your shelter beds. So let's move further and understand what is water. Do you guys know that 3/4 of the Earth's surface is actually covered with a vital renewable natural resource, which is what? Obviously water, right? So oceans cover about 2/3 of the Earth's surface and support a rich variety of plants and animal life. However, it's saline and not useful for human consumption, whereas fresh water accounts for what? Only 2.7%, and 70% of these occurs in what? As ice sheets and glaciers in Atlantica, Greenland, and mountainous regions, and they are inaccessible because of their location, right? Now, thus only 1% of the fresh water is actually what is useful for the human consumption. So for human consumption, we only have what? Only 1% of this fresh water. So water can neither be added nor subtracted from the earth, as you have seen, and its total volume remains constant. Its only abundance seems to be vary only because of the constant motion cycling through the oceans, the air, the land, and back again, through the processes of evaporation, precipitation, and runoff. And this, as you already know, is referred to as what? Water cycle. So it's what? It's nothing but water cycle. So let's understand about the problems of water availability. So most part of the world are facing shortages in fresh water supply. Countries located in climatic zones are that most susceptible to drought face great problems of water scarcity. Thus, water shortage may be a consequence of variation in seasonal or annual precipitation, or the scarcity is caused by overexploitation and contamination of water resources. To get access to clean water and adequate water resources, there are some steps that have been taken to prevent it. For example, forest and other vegetation cover slow the surface runoff and replenish the groundwater. So this can actually be very, very helpful. Next is water harvesting is another method to save the surface runoff. So again, water harvesting. Next is the canals used for irrigating fields should be properly lined to minimize the loss by water seepage. So yes, this could also be done. Then sprinklers effectively irrigate the area by checking water losses through the seepage and evaporation. And in dry regions with high rates of evaporation, drip or trickle irrigation is very, very useful. So this is exactly how we can practice irrigation, and we can actually help to slow the surface runoff. So these are some of the steps which we can actually take, I guess, very, very easily to do conservation of water resources. Now let's move to natural vegetation and wildlife. So what do you people know about natural vegetation and wildlife? Tell me. Okay, let me only begin with it. Natural vegetation and wildlife exist only in the narrow zone of contact between what? Your lithosphere, your hydrosphere and atmosphere. And what do we call it? The biosphere. So that means what? The natural vegetation and wildlife only exist in a narrow zone that is comprised of what? Your lithosphere, your hydrosphere and your atmosphere. And combining these three, what do we get? Combining these three, we get biosphere. So we are going to get biosphere by having these three together. And when we are going to have lithosphere and hydrosphere and atmosphere together, then comprising all these three, we are going to get what? Biosphere. Now in the biosphere, living beings are interrelated and interdependent on each other for survival. And this life supporting system is known as what? Your ecosystem. And this is exactly what is termed as what? Ecosystem. Now wildlife includes your animals, your birds, your insects as well as aquatic life forms. The birds feed on the insects and act as decomposers. So what do they act as? I'm going to write it here. Decomposers. So they act as decomposers. Now vultures, due to their ability to feed on dead livestock, are scavengers. So what are they? Scavengers. And are considered a vital cleaner of the environment. So animals, big or small, all are integral to maintain a balance in the ecosystem. Now, let's study about the distribution of natural vegetation. So the growth of vegetation depends primarily on what? Your temperature and moisture. That is not your temperature, but the temperature of the environment. Okay. Now the major vegetation types of the world are grouped as your forest, your grasslands, your scrubs, your tundra, etc. In the area of heavy rainfall, huge trees thrive and forests are thus associated with areas having abundant water supply. As the number of moisture decreases, the size of trees and their density also reduces. Short stunt trees and shrubs grows in regions of moderate rainfall. In dry areas, thorny shrubs and scrubs grow in low rainfall areas. So now let's read to actually, how to conserve the natural vegetation and wildlife. So what is exactly the process of conservation? Now, changes in the climate and human interference can cause the loss of natural habitats for plants and animals. And deforestation, soil erosion, construction activities, forest fires, tsunami and landslides are some of the human and natural factors that accelerate the process of extension of these resources. One other major concern is poaching, which results in a sharp decline in the number of particular species. National parks, wildlife sanctuaries and biosphere reserves are made to protect our natural vegetation and wildlife. Conservation of creeks, lakes and wetlands is necessary to save the precious resources from depletion. So for that, the awareness programs like your social forestry and One Mahotsav are also established at the regional and also at the community level. School children are also encouraged to bird watch and visit nature camps so that they appreciate the habitat of varied species. Many countries have passed laws against the trade as well as the killing of the birds and animals. In India, killing lions, tigers, deers, great Indian bustards, and peacocks is actually illegal. Meanwhile, an international convention, that is CITES, I'm going to write it here, CITES has been established that lists several species of animals and birds in which trade is prohibited. Now, we have reached the end of our discussion. I hope you people understood the chapter. Stay tuned for more amazing content. Thank you.